Talking here about war in the Middle East or in Iraq or Afghanistan or in Gaza, where that's acceptable violence, whereas, I don't know, I'm trying to think of some form of unacceptable. Oh, I know. We were discussing earlier a trial that took place against some anarchist activists, and somebody got 20 years for torching an SUV. Okay, now, torching an SUV, torching a town, 20 years, military medal. What is violence and what's acceptable and not, I think is such a double standard in this country, that police violence on certain, to quote, do their jobs is an acceptable thing, whereas somebody punching that policeman is not. So what I'm trying to say is that the discussion of violence has to be seen in light of who's trying to tell you what about what. And who's using the violence. I, of course, renounce unnecessary violence. However, I also believe that, and this is not my idea, but one from an old socialist, well, he's dead, but socialist from a Russian revolutionary socialist by the name of Leon Trotsky, who said about morality and violence, you cannot equate the violence of a slave to the violence of the slaveholder. One is a justified violence to free yourself. The other one is a violence to keep you oppressed. And by the way, you don't need to go back to a socialist. That was just my way of making a plug for Leon Trotsky. Go back to Martin Luther King. Dr. Martin Luther King's speech at the Riverside Church in New York City in 1967, where he was denounced by the New York Times, by all the leading liberal figures, because he said, I will no longer stay silent about my country's use of violence. And he explained, when I went, some of the kids in some of the cities where there had been urban unrest and so forth, asked him, how can you talk about denouncing violence when it's being used by the United States government? He got up and said, and therefore I must denounce the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, and that is the government of the United States. For those of you who have not read that speech or listened to it, go and do so, because, and I'll say, that's all I'll say about that, because there's been such a turnaround in the discussion of violence, that basic and simple point that he made so long ago, and we all are expected to celebrate Dr. King, and we should, but let's celebrate it in the right way. As to whether or not violence is necessary in revolutions, I think that if you have a movement of majority support, that the problem is not from the movement that's seeking change, but from those who insist on maintaining their power. And that's true throughout the history of revolutions, and that's how I would say it. I'm not for the AK-47, I'm for the disarming of those people who would point them at the majority. That's the way I think I would phrase it. And now, I apologize, I've gone on too long, but what would I say, what would Marx say about, if I knew what Marx would say, I'd cash in on, no, I'm just joking. I'd read a couple of other things. I think that what Marx would say about Sweden is twofold. One, that it's a very, very advanced state it's an advanced welfare state, which is preferable to not having those kinds of social provisions, but that at the core, the question of the control over the means of producing that wealth and the priorities of doing so still lie in private hands, and that secondly, those are subject at the end of the day to the determinations of the world market rather than the wishes of those people who inhabit Sweden or that part of Europe. So that you now have in Sweden precisely the same kind of movement towards significant austerity measures, which has caused a huge crisis in the political situation in Sweden and a big shift in the last elections. But I think those would be the aspects that he would focus on. Last thing, and I'll come back to this again because I don't want to give it short shrift. Marx was extremely conscious of the use by the capitalist class and by other classes. It wasn't, of the idea of divide and rule, of the idea that you would use racial differences or sexual differences to continue the division of workers one from the other. He was particularly conscious of that in relationship to the American South. If you remember, for those of you who remember or know Frederick Douglass, you divide one from the other in order to conquer both. That was Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist, who spoke of black slaves and white sharecroppers and what would happen between them. And Marx was very conscious of that. The other aspect of it he treated at some length was anti-Irish racism in England. And in essence, he said the secret of the impotence of the English working class movement was the fact that they accepted racism against the Irish. And in terms of the States, it's a brilliant thing. He said, no real, genuine workers' movement will develop in the United States until it deals with the question of racism. I have the exact quotations in the book. I'll dig them up before the end. They're wonderful. Labor in white skin will never be free until labor in black skin is. You know, it's that kind of understanding. He also, I think, understood that it's a complicated question about how to overcome that. You know, how to overcome the antagonism and the hostility. Because it wasn't just ideas in people's heads, it was also that people were pitted against each other consciously, economically, competing for jobs, for housing, for school, and that inflamed the relations between the two. You have to control.
All right, got some good discussion going here. Just want to thank everybody again for coming out tonight, and if you appreciate us being able to bring speakers like this, we're just going to be passing a little tin can around. Any kind of donations are welcome. It's all going to be used for gas money, get more speakers down here like this before. So appreciate that, and let's keep the discussion going. I'd like to hear from everybody in the room, whether it's a short question, comment, or what. I got Sarah right here in the middle, and then right here, this guy.
I'm wondering, in the interest of taking better control of our labor, if it would be necessary to make goals for direct action, like not supporting restaurants or grocery stores as much, to support farmers, especially in areas like Eugene and Oregon that have the ability to have mini farms, because if there's materials in these stores and the concept of restaurants is in a sense directly exploiting the people who don't have the ability to purchase, or would be considered stealing by taking some foods. Like, if not supporting restaurants and grocery stores in the long haul will help labor be more centralized and united.
All right, good question.
Okay. Hi, I'm Paul, Chicago, and I just want to come back on a couple things. First, on the question of what Marx had to say about revolution. Marx didn't write one single piece, which was his view on revolution, but he wrote a lot about revolution and what revolutions are and how they look. And he made a distinction between different kinds of revolutions. For example, he made a distinction between a political and a social revolution. So, for example, you could have a revolution which overthrew a particular government structure, replaced it with another. It didn't alter the fundamental economic or social relations in that society, which is really called political revolution. But what Marx is talking about in the Communist Manifesto, when he talks about working class revolution, is both a political and a social revolution. And so he argues that says at the beginning, each history of human societies is a history of class struggle. And he says that the task of the working class is to win the battle of democracy. So he says it is a political movement. It has to be a political movement if the state is an instrument for the suppression of one class by another. So the working class has to have some kind of democratic state power, which is political power, but it has to use that political power to overturn the social relations that exist under capitalism. Make inroads, nationalize the banks, create democratic control of the factories and the workplaces, organize that in a centralized basis, begin to create a planned society in which money is suppressed over time and so on, all the things that he talks about in the manifesto. So I think Marx was pretty, quote, wrote quite a lot about actual revolutions. He participated in 1848 and had a lot to say very specifically about revolutions and the different forms that they took. And I think there's an excellent book by Hal Draper, a series of books called Marxist Theory of Revolution. And it's about 4 or 5 volumes. I think it's 5. Is it 5 volumes?
Yeah.
That's an excellent place to start, because what Draper does is he goes through all the different parts of Marx's writings and gleans from it everything he had to say about the question. So I do recommend that. And the only thing I want to say about the autonomy of the individual is that we live in a society in which if the question of freedom, as it's talked about today, is very vague, and often it's about the autonomy of the individual. And the implication is, and it goes back to the French Revolution, is that capitalism brings liberty to the individual. And usually, or in almost every case, that what's referred to, or what that's referring to, is the idea of the freedom of the individual is the freedom to exploit. I can have my own business. It's the freedom of the market. But the reality of capitalism is that, and I think that's Ahmed's allusion at the beginning of his talk about, the sameness. Socialism will make us all the same. And the reality is, we live in a society where advertising assumes and accepts